February 1945. The timeline of history was bending, snapping under the weight of a world on fire. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally bleeding toward its conclusion. But in a desolate, wind-swept corner of the Belgian borderlands, the grand strategy of armies meant nothing. Here, survival was reduced to a terrifyingly small equation for 87 German women sitting in a freezing prison camp. They huddled together, waiting to see if the Canadian soldiers guarding them would simply leave them to die in the snow. To understand the sheer terror gripping their hearts, you have to understand the world they had lived in for 12 years. These women had been told their entire lives, through every radio broadcast, every newspaper headline, and every school lesson, that the enemy would show no mercy. This was the core of the Nazi indoctrination machine, the belief that the Allies were not just opposing soldiers, but biological threats, monsters intent on the total annihilation of the German people. Specifically, they had been warned that German women captured by the enemy would face a fate worse than death. Now, as the coldest winter in decades gripped Europe, a massive blizzard was barreling straight for their camp. The atmospheric pressure was dropping, the sky was turning a bruised purple-gray, and they were about to find out if everything they believed was the absolute truth or a fatal lie. Germany was falling apart. It wasn't just losing, it was disintegrating. The Allied armies were pushing deeper into German territory with the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave. The thousand-year Reich was crumbling into dust. Cities that once stood proud, monuments to German engineering and culture, were now unrecognizable piles of broken stone, twisted rebar, and ash. The Nazi government, which had promised total victory and a new world order, was now running, hiding, and issuing suicidal orders to hold ground that could not be held. The infrastructure of civilization had vanished. Food was gone. Medicine was gone. Hope was a distant memory. Across northern Europe, the temperatures plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, a bone-crushing cold that froze engine oil and snapped metal. Supply trucks could not get through the suffocating drifts of snow. Train tracks, the arteries of the war machine, were bombed into twisted sculptures of steel. Roads disappeared under sheets of black ice and frozen mud. In the cities, people were starving in the streets, boiling shoe leather for soup. Soldiers were surrendering by the thousands, realizing the futility of fighting for a dead cause. And in this chaotic retreat, amidst the fog of war, these 87 women had been captured. It is important to clarify who they were. They were not regular soldiers, nor were they innocent bystanders. They were Times Wehrmachthhelferinnen in times, signals helpers. They were the nervous system of the German military. They had worked in communications, sending encrypted messages, operating high-frequency radios, and keeping the German military units connected across the crumbling front. They were young, ranging between 19 and 34 years old. Why were they there? The reasons were as complex as the war itself. Many had joined because they were true believers, swept up in the fervor of nationalism and the promise of a glorious future. They believed in their country with a blinding intensity. Others joined because they had no choice. The state demanded service, and refusal was treason. Some came from affluent, cultured families in Berlin and Munich. Women who had once worn silk and played the piano. Others grew up on small, subsistence farms where they never had enough food even before the war began. But now, in the freezing mud of a prison camp, none of that social hierarchy mattered. The war had stripped away their status. They were prisoners. They were enemy combatants. And winter, the great equalizer, did not care about their stories or their politics. The makeshift prison facility where they waited was a death trap. It was never meant to hold human beings through a winter of this magnitude. It was a hasty collection of old storage buildings with thin, single-layer wooden walls and shattered windows that rattled in the gale. The wind didn't just blow outside. It cut through every crack, slicing into the room like a knife. At night, the scene was one of medieval misery. The women huddled together on the rough, cold floor, creating a pile of bodies to share the few thin blankets the Canadians had managed to issue them. Their breath plumed in clouds in the freezing air, creating a microclimate of damp cold within the barracks. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. Some women already had frostbite on their fingers and toes, the flesh turning waxy and white, then black. The pain was constant, a sharp, throbbing reminder of their vulnerability. They survived on a starvation diet of 400 calories a day. To put that in perspective, a healthy, working woman in that climate required at least 2,000 to 2,500 calories just to maintain body heat. 400 calories meant 2 small, shriveled potatoes and a dry piece of bread. Their bodies were cannibalizing themselves. Their stomachs cramped constantly from hunger pangs that never went away. Their uniforms, once crisp and proud, were falling apart at the seams. Many did not have proper winter coats, having lost them in the chaotic retreat. Some wrapped themselves in layers of old newspapers, stuffing the paper into their boots to try to insulate their freezing feet. These women had been forced to march for days before they were captured. The German army was retreating so rapidly that the logistics collapsed, leaving personnel behind like flotsam in the wake of a sinking ship. The women had walked through snow and sucking mud with almost no food. Their feet bled inside broken boots. When the Canadian soldiers finally found them, the women were more than happy to surrender. Anything, literally anything, was better than walking through the frozen countryside with no help coming, waiting to freeze to death in a ditch. At least in the camp, they had walls around them. At least they had a roof, even if it leaked icy water. At least they were not being shot at by strafing aircraft anymore. But while their bodies were temporarily stationary, their minds were trapped in a prison of fear built by years of Nazi propaganda. Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda ministry had filled their heads with terrible, vivid stories. For years, they heard that the Canadians, Americans, and British were not men, but monsters. The propaganda posters plastered on every street corner showed Allied soldiers as cruel beasts, often with exaggerated features, depicted as rapists and murderers who would hurt German women and children for sport. The radio broadcasts, the voice of the Reich, hissed that the enemy would torture prisoners to extract information and then discard them. Teachers in school had told them that surrender was not an option because surrender meant death. Even their own officers, men they trusted, had warned them right before the capture. "If they catch you, they will show no mercy," one lieutenant had said, his eyes wide with urgency. "They will use you, violate you, and then throw you away like garbage." The women believed it because it was the only reality they had ever known. When you hear the same lie 1,000 times from every authority figure you respect, it creates a psychological fortress that is almost impossible to breach. It starts to sound not just like the truth, but like common sense. Now they sat in that cold camp, and they waited for the axe to fall. The guards were mostly young Canadian men, draftees and volunteers, some barely older than the women themselves. The guards brought them food and water. They did not strike them. They did not yell or threaten, but the women watched them with the eyes of hunted animals. They did not trust the silence. They did not trust the apparent lack of violence. They interpreted it as a sinister delay. They thought it was a trick, that the Canadians were fattening them up or waiting for orders, and that the real cruelty, the true nature of the enemy, would reveal itself later. At night, in the dark, they whispered their fears to each other. "They are waiting," one woman named Greta said, her voice trembling. "When we are no use to them, that is when it will happen. They are toying with us." The others nodded in agreement. They all felt it. The fear lived in their chests like a heavy, cold stone, making it hard to breathe even when the air wasn't freezing. Then, the situation escalated from miserable to critical. The camp commander received the meteorological report. A massive blizzard, a weather bomb, was forming over the North Sea and heading directly for them. The temperature would drop even further, to levels that caused immediate hypothermia. The wind would reach dangerous, hurricane-force speeds. Snow would fall so heavily that a person could not see 5 feet in front of them, creating whiteout conditions. The storm was predicted to last for 2 days, maybe 3, and this camp, with its rotting wood walls and broken windows, was a coffin. It would not protect anyone. The heating systems were non-existent. If they stayed, the snow would bury the buildings, and the cold would kill them all in their sleep. The Canadian commander called his officers together. "We have to evacuate," he said. pointing to the map. If we stay here, people will freeze to death. We have a moral obligation to move. When the women heard the news of the evacuation, the fear turned into absolute terror. To the Canadians, evacuation meant safety. To the German women, evacuation meant leaving the relative security of the camp walls. Leaving the camp meant going out into the blizzard. And going out into the blizzard meant exactly what the propaganda had always promised: the death march. They were convinced this was the plan. The Canadians would march them into the wilderness, away from witnesses, and leave them there. The soldiers would save themselves in their vehicles and let the German prisoners freeze. It made perfect, terrifying sense to them. Why would the enemy waste precious fuel, food, and energy to save them? Why would Allied soldiers risk their own lives for women who had worked for the Wehrmacht, helping to kill Allied troops? The women looked at each other with wide, frightened eyes. This was it. This was the moment they had feared since the day they were captured. They were going to die in the snow, and no one would ever know what happened to them. They would just be more missing persons in a continent filled with millions of ghosts. The morning the blizzard was supposed to arrive, the atmosphere was heavy with dread. The women woke up expecting the worst day of their lives. Through the thin walls, they could hear the heavy rumble of trucks pulling up outside. Diesel engines coughed and roared in the cold air. Men shouted orders to each other, their voices urgent. The women pulled their thin coats tighter, shivering violently, and stood together in small groups, holding hands as if physical contact could ward off the coming doom. Some were crying quietly, tears freezing on their cheeks. Others stared at nothing, their faces masks of despair, empty of hope. Greta, who was 22 years old and had once dreamed of being a teacher, looked at the youngest girl in the group. She was only 19, barely more than a child, with wide, panicked eyes. "Stay close to me," Greta whispered, gripping the girl's hand. The girl nodded, her teeth chattering so hard it sounded like a rattle. The doors banged open, and Canadian soldiers walked in. The women braced themselves for violence. They expected shouting, rifle butts, rough hands grabbing them. But no one grabbed them, no one yelled. Instead, the officer in charge stood in the doorway, his breath steaming, and spoke in broken, practiced German. "We move now. Storm coming. Need to go to safe place." The women did not move. They stood rooted to the spot. They did not believe him. Safe place was a euphemism. It was just another way of saying the middle of nowhere, where no one would find their frozen bodies until the spring thaw. But they had no choice. In war, when soldiers with guns tell you to move, you move. They filed outside into the bitter, biting cold. The wind was already picking up, howling like a wounded animal, blowing snow across the ground in horizontal white sheets. It stung their faces and blinded them. The women expected to see the soldiers pointing to a road, bayonets fixed, ready to force them to march at gunpoint. But instead, they saw something that made no sense. It broke the logic of their world. The trucks were there, yes. Large, canvas-covered transport trucks, but the soldiers were not loading the women into them. One of the younger soldiers walked up to the officer, his face pale with cold. He shook his head grimly. "Sir, the roads are completely blocked. We have 60 centimeters of snow already, and drifts are over a meter high. The trucks cannot get through. The axles will drag. We'll be stuck in 10 minutes. The officer nodded slowly, assessing the tactical nightmare. He looked at the trucks, then at the shivering women, then at his men. He made a decision that defied every rule of warfare the women had been taught to expect. He turned to his men and said, "Then we carry them." For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was louder than the wind. The German women stared at the Canadians, trying to translate the words, trying to understand the intent. The Canadians looked at each other. They were tired. They were cold. They wanted to go home. But then, slowly, the soldiers started taking off their heavy winter greatcoats. They walked toward the prisoners, holding out the coats. "Here," one soldier said in English, gesturing for a woman to take his heavy wool coat. She looked at him like he was insane. Why would a conqueror give his armor to the conquered? He smiled a little, a tired, human smile, and put the coat around her shoulders himself. She was so shocked she could not speak. She just stood there, feeling the warmth of the enemy's body trapped in the wool. All around, other soldiers were doing the same thing. It was a cascade of generosity. They gave away their scarves, they gave away their gloves. One soldier took off his precious wool blanket that he carried in his pack, his only source of comfort, and wrapped it around a teenage girl whose fingers were black with frostbite. "You need this more than me," he said, even though she could not understand his words. The tone was enough. Then, the carrying began. This was not a march, it was a rescue mission. The weakest women, the ones who were so malnourished they could barely stand, were lifted onto soldiers' backs. The men bent down and let the women climb on, piggyback style, like fathers carrying tired children after a long day. The women were terrified at first, stiff and afraid to touch these men, but the soldiers were gentle. They adjusted the weight, made sure the women were secure, and then started walking into the white abyss. The path ahead was not a road anymore. It was just white emptiness, a void where the world used to be, with snow already up to their knees in some places. The wind howled around them, blowing ice pellets into their faces, but the soldiers kept walking. Greta walked beside a soldier who was carrying her friend Anna. She watched his face as he trudged through the deep snow. His breath came out in heavy, rhythmic clouds. Sweat formed on his forehead, freezing into ice on his eyebrows, even in the sub-zero cold. He was working incredibly hard. After 15 minutes, another soldier called out, "Switch time!" The man carrying Anna carefully lowered her down, and another soldier immediately took his place, lifting Anna onto his back without a single word of complaint. They were rotating, Greta realized with a start. They were sharing the burden, organizing themselves like a machine, but a machine built for mercy, not war. They ensured no one man would collapse from exhaustion. These soldiers were burning their own calories, risking their own fatigue to save their prisoners' lives. Every hour, the group stopped to rest. The soldiers pulled out thermoses from their packs and poured hot chocolate into small metal cups. In the German army, rations were strictly prioritized for the fighting men. But here, the Canadians passed the cups to the German women times first asterisk. Greta took a sip and almost cried. It was sweet, shockingly sweet and warm. She had not tasted sugar in months. In Germany, even before she was captured, sugar was a luxury, impossible to find. It was saved for the military elite, and even then, there was never enough. But here, these Canadian soldiers were giving their sugar rations their energy source to enemy prisoners. "Drink," the soldier said, pointing at the cup when Greta tried to give it back after one polite sip. "You need it more." She drank it all, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, thawing the ice around her heart. The contrast was so sharp it physically hurt to think about. Greta had expected bayonets pointed at their backs, forcing them to march until they dropped dead in the drifts. She had expected cruelty, mockery, and violence. She had expected to be left in a ditch when she could not walk anymore, but instead, she walked beside men who gave up their own warmth to keep her alive. Men who carried her friends on their backs through waist-deep snow, men who shared their food and hot drinks. Men who stopped every 15 minutes to switch, who was carrying the heaviest burden, making sure no one suffered alone. The camp medic, a Canadian man with kind eyes and steady, capable hands, moved through the group checking on the women. When he found one with an injured ankle, swollen and purple, he stopped everyone. He opened his medical bag and pulled out a small glass bottle, morphine. Greta knew what it was. Morphine was precious gold in wartime. It was saved for the most serious injuries, for soldiers with blown-off limbs. In the German army, they barely had any left. They were operating without anesthesia. But this medic used it on a German prisoner, injecting it carefully to ease her pain. "This will help," he said softly, though the woman could not understand him. He wrapped the ankle tight with fresh bandages and helped another soldier lift her onto his back. As they walked, Greta's mind was spinning. It was a cognitive collapse. Everything she had been taught was being challenged by what she saw with her own eyes. The propaganda posters showed Allied soldiers as evil monsters. The radio said they were barbarians without honor. Her officers warned that capture meant torture and death. But these men, these Canadian soldiers, were suffering in the cold because they refused to leave prisoners behind. They were exhausted, sweating despite the freezing temperature. Their legs were shaking from the effort of walking through the deep snow. But they did not stop. They did not complain. When one woman stumbled, 3 soldiers rushed to help her up. When another started crying from fear and cold, a soldier walking beside her started humming a song, something gentle and calming, trying to make her feel less afraid. The storm was getting worse. The wind screamed around them, a cacophony of nature's fury. Snow fell so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. It was a white wall, but the line of soldiers and prisoners kept moving forward, step by difficult step. And Greta, walking through that blizzard, surrounded by men she was supposed to fear, felt something breaking inside her chest. It was not her body breaking, it was something deeper. It was the wall of lies she had lived behind her whole life, starting to crack and crumble in the face of simple, undeniable kindness. They had been walking for almost 3 hours when Greta's legs finally gave out. One moment she was taking another step through the snow, and the next moment she was on her knees, the world spinning. Her body simply refused to go any further. The caloric deficit had caught up to her. She had not eaten a real meal in weeks. She had not slept well in months. Her biological reserves were empty. She knelt there in the snow, breathing hard, waiting for the soldiers to yell at her, or leave her behind. This was it, she thought. This was where her luck ran out. The group had to keep moving to survive. She was dead weight, but a young Canadian corporal stopped beside her. He looked down at her with concern, not anger. He was maybe 24 or 25 years old, with brown hair and eyes that looked incredibly tired. He bent down and said something in English that she did not understand. Then he turned around and pointed at his back, making it clear what he wanted. He was offering to carry her. Greta shook her head quickly. No, she whispered. She did not want to be a burden. She was the enemy. She did not deserve this kind of help. But the corporal just smiled a little and waited. When she did not move, he gently helped her up and positioned her on his back. Her arms went around his shoulders, his hands holding her legs. Then he started walking. For the first few minutes, Greta was rigid with fear and shame. She was an enemy soldier being carried by a man she was supposed to hate, a man she had helped fight against. It felt wrong. It felt impossible. But as the corporal kept walking, step after step, through snow that was now up to his waist in places, she started to feel something else. She felt his breathing, heavy and labored. She felt how his whole body worked to push through the deep snow while carrying her weight. She felt him stumble once, catch himself, and keep going without complaint. And slowly, the fear started to change into something she could not name. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then an hour. The corporal did not stop. Other soldiers called out, "Hey, you need a break? Let us swap." But he shook his head and kept walking. His breath came harder now, rasping in his throat. She could feel his shoulders shaking from the effort. She could feel the heat radiating from his body even through their clothes. After 2 hours, Greta could not stay silent anymore. She had learned a little bit of English before the war, in school, though she was never very good at it. She leaned close to his ear, shouting over the wind, "I am sorry, too heavy. You tired?" The corporal turned his head slightly so she could hear him over the howling gale. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost kind. "My sister's your age," he said slowly, enunciating the words so she might understand. Someone would do this for her. Then he kept walking. Those words hit Greta like a physical blow. She felt something inside her chest break open, something that had been locked tight her whole life. This man was not carrying her because he had orders to do so. He was not doing it to look good or to win points with his commander. He was carrying her because he had a sister at home, somewhere in Canada, who was 22 years old just like Greta, and in his mind, he projected that love onto her. If his sister was trapped in a blizzard in a foreign country, he hoped that someone, even an enemy, would carry her to safety too. He saw her as a person, not a German, not a Nazi, not an enemy combatant, not a piece of propaganda, just a young woman who needed help. Greta pressed her face against his shoulder, burying her face in the rough wool of his uniform, and cried. She tried to be quiet about it, but her whole body shook with sobs. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed, was a lie. The propaganda posters that covered every wall in Germany showed Allied soldiers as monsters with evil faces, ready to destroy German women. The radio broadcasts that played every day said the enemy had no honor, no mercy, no humanity. Her teachers in school said the Allies wanted to wipe Germany off the map and would torture anyone they captured. Her own officers, right before she was captured, warned her that the Canadians would violate German women and leave them to die in ditches. She had believed all of it because everyone around her believed it too. When an entire country tells you something is true, you stop questioning it. Peer pressure and fear are powerful drugs. But here, in the middle of a killing blizzard, with snow falling so thick she could barely see, a Canadian soldier was carrying her on his back because she reminded him of his sister. He was exhausted, his legs were shaking, his breath came in gasps. But he did not put her down. He did not complain. He just kept walking, one step at a time, making sure she survived. If this was a lie, Greta thought, what else was a lie? If they lied about the enemy being monsters, what else did they lie about? Did they lie about Germany winning the war? Did they lie about why the war started? Did they lie about who the real monsters were? The questions flooded her mind, and each one felt like another crack in a dam that was about to burst. Her whole worldview, everything she thought she knew about the world, was built on propaganda and fear, and now she could see it for what it was, a construct designed to control her. She thought about the last 2 years of her life. She thought about her friends who died in bombing raids. She thought about the cities destroyed. She thought about the millions of people suffering and dying. And for what? So leaders could stay in power? So men in fancy uniforms could feel important? She had given 2 years of her life to the Wehrmacht, sending their messages, helping their war machine run, believing she was protecting her country. But her country had lied to her about everything. They sent her to fight an enemy that was not evil. They told her to fear people who were actually kind. They filled her head with hate and then sent her out to suffer and die for their lies. The corporal stumbled again, this time almost falling into a drift. Another soldier rushed over. "Let me take her, mate. You are done. You're going to drop." The corporal shook his head, grimacing. "Almost there," he said. "I can make it." The other soldier looked worried but nodded. They kept walking. Greta could see buildings in the distance now, barely visible dark shapes through the swirling snow. The safe place was real. It was not a trick. They were actually taking the prisoners to shelter. When they finally reached the new facility, a proper building with real brick walls, heating, and glass in the windows, the corporal carefully lowered Greta to the ground. She stood on shaky legs and looked at him. His face was red from effort and cold. Sweat and melted snow dripped from his hair. His hands shook from exhaustion. He looked like he had run a marathon, but he smiled at her, a real, genuine smile, and said, "You okay now?" Greta did not have the English words to say what she wanted to say. She did not know how to articulate the profound shift in her soul. She did not know how to tell him that he had just changed her entire life, that he had saved her not just from the cold, but from the hatred that had been planted in her heart. So she just nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said the only English word she knew for certain. "Thank you, thank you." That night, lying on a real bed with real blankets in a warm room, Greta stared at the ceiling and thought about everything. The other women were talking quietly around her, their voices filled with awe, still shocked by what had happened. "They carried us," one woman kept saying over and over like a mantra. "I don't believe it. They carried us. They gave us their coats. They gave us their food. They carried us through a blizzard," another woman said. "Everything they told us was wrong." And Greta whispered into the dark room, "We marched expecting death. Instead, we found men who carried us to safety." Everything we were told was a lie. She thought about the corporal and his sister back in Canada. She thought about all the soldiers who rotated carrying the weakest women, who shared their morphine and their hot chocolate, who gave up their warmth so prisoners would not freeze. These were supposed to be the barbarians. These were supposed to be the monsters without mercy, but they had more mercy in their actions than her own government had shown in words. The Nazi leaders who promised to protect Germany had sent young women into war zones with no real training and inadequate supplies. But enemy soldiers, men who had every reason to hate Germans, had risked their lives in a blizzard to save them. Greta rolled over and pulled the wool blanket closer. It was the corporal's blanket, the one he had insisted she keep. She held it tight, burying her nose in the rough fabric, and made a promise to herself. She would never forget this. She would never forget what real humanity looked like, and if she survived this war, if she made it home, she would tell everyone the truth about what happened in that blizzard. She would tell them that the enemy was not who they thought. And she would spend the rest of her life questioning everything she was told, because she had learned the hardest way possible that governments lie and propaganda kills. But kindness in the face of suffering is the only truth that really matters. The war ended in May of 1945. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted barely 12 years. By the time Greta was finally allowed to go home, it was early 1946. She had spent almost a year in Canadian custody, first in Belgium, and then in a proper POW camp in France. The Canadians continued to treat her well. They gave her enough food that she gained back the weight she had lost. They let her write letters home, though most of them never arrived because the German postal system had collapsed along with the government. They even gave her a little bit of money when she was released, enough to buy a train ticket and some food for the journey. Before she left, Greta asked one of the guards if he knew how to find the corporal who had carried her through the blizzard. The guard checked some papers and wrote down an address in Ontario, Canada. "If you write to him, the letter should find him," the guard said. Greta folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket like it was made of solid gold. She also carried two other things with her. One was a small pressed flower, a tiny white wildflower she had found growing near the facility where they had sheltered from the blizzard. She had picked it in the spring and pressed it between two pieces of paper, saving it as a reminder that life could grow even in places where people expected only death. The other thing she carried was the wool blanket the corporal had given her. It was worn and faded now, with a few holes from moths, but she would not leave it behind. That blanket meant more to her than almost anything else she owned. It was proof that what happened was real, that it was not just a fever dream she had made up in her desperate mind. The train ride back to Germany was long and depressing. It was a journey through a graveyard. Everywhere Greta looked, she saw destruction on a scale that was hard to comprehend. Train stations were bombed into piles of broken concrete. Bridges were blown apart, twisting into the rivers below, forcing the train to take long, slow detours. Fields that should have been growing food were torn up by tank treads and poisoned by chemicals. Small towns were just empty shells, windows broken, walls collapsed, nobody living there anymore. And the people on the train, the other Germans heading home, looked like ghosts. They were thin and pale, their clothes hanging off their frames. Their eyes were empty, staring at nothing. Nobody talked much. What was there to say? They had lost everything. The arrogance of 1940 was gone, replaced by the hollow shock of 1946. When Greta finally arrived in Hamburg, the city she had grown up in, she almost did not recognize it. Hamburg had been one of the most beautiful cities in Germany before the war, a center of trade and culture, with grand buildings and busy streets and parks full of trees. Now it looked like the surface of the moon. Operation Gomorrah, the Allied bombing campaign, had done its work. Entire neighborhoods were just rubble and ash. The firestorms had melted the asphalt of the streets. People lived in the basements of destroyed buildings, making shelters out of whatever scraps they could find. Children with dirty faces and torn clothes begged for food on street corners, their eyes old before their time. Old women dug through piles of bricks, looking for anything useful, anything they could sell or trade for a potato. The smell of smoke and decay hung over everything, a permanent reminder of the catastrophe. This was what losing a war looked like. This was the receipt for the lies they had bought. This was what happened when leaders lied to their people and sent them to die for nothing. Greta found her family living in what used to be a shop. The front was completely destroyed, blown open to the street, but the back room still had a roof and 3 walls. Her mother cried when she saw her, holding her so tight Greta could barely breathe. Her father looked older than she remembered, his posture defeated. His hair was completely gray now. His face was thin and lined with deep worry. Her younger brother was there too, missing his left arm from a battle in the final, desperate weeks of the war. They were alive, which was more than many families could say, but they were broken. That first night, sitting around a tiny fire made from broken furniture, Greta tried to tell them about the blizzard. She wanted to share the one bright spark of humanity she had found in the darkness. She told them how the Canadian soldiers had carried the prisoners to safety, how they had given up their own coats and food, how one man had carried her for 2 hours because she reminded him of his sister. She expected them to be moved. She expected them to be grateful, but her father listened with a hard face, his jaw clenched. When she finished, he shook his head bitterly. "They were trying to make us look weak," he said, spitting into the fire. "It was propaganda, a trick to make us grateful, to humiliate us." Her mother nodded, agreeing with him. "The Allies wanted to destroy Germany. They still do. Look at our city. Look at the rubble. You were just lucky. You did not see their real faces." Greta stared at them in shock. Even now, even after losing the war, even after their city was destroyed, and their son lost an arm, and they were living in a ruined shop eating scraps, they still believed the lies. They still clung to the propaganda like it was a life raft in a storm. She tried again, her voice rising with frustration. "No, you do not understand. They were kind. They saved our lives when they could have left us to freeze. They treated us like human beings. They gave me this blanket, but her father just got angry." He stood up, his face flushing. "Stop talking like that," he said sharply. "You sound like you're on their side. We were right to fight. We were defending our homeland against savages. Do not dishonor your country by praising the enemy." Greta stopped talking after that. She looked at her parents and realized a tragic truth. Some people would never let go of the lies, no matter what the truth was. They needed to believe that Germany was right and everyone else was wrong. Because if they admitted the truth, they would have to face what they had supported. They would have to admit that they had cheered for a government that murdered millions and destroyed their own country. The psychological weight of that guilt was too heavy. It was easier to keep believing the lies than to face the mirror, but Greta could not live like that. The contrast between what she had experienced and what she saw at home was too sharp, too painful. In Canada, even enemy prisoners were treated with dignity and given enough food. In Germany, German citizens were starving and living in ruins, abandoned by the same government that promised to protect them. The Canadian soldiers had valued German lives more than Germany's own leaders ever did. That was the truth that burned in her chest every single day. She kept the wool blanket for 40 years, folded carefully in a drawer. It became a sacred object to her. Sometimes, when the world seemed dark or cruel, she would take it out and hold it, feeling the rough wool, remembering that day in the blizzard. She wrote letters to the corporal in Canada, and eventually, miraculously, got a response. He was doing well, working as a teacher, married with 3 children. They exchanged letters for years, an unlikely friendship spanning the ocean between former enemies. He told her about Canada, about the lakes and the peace. She told him about trying to rebuild Germany, about the struggle to create a democracy from the ashes. She thanked him over and over for what he did, pouring her gratitude onto the page. And he always wrote back the same thing, humble and steady. "I did what anyone should do. You were suffering, and I could help. That is all." As Germany slowly rebuilt itself over the years, rising from the rubble to become a new nation, Greta made it her mission to tell young people about what really happened during the war. She refused to let the history be rewritten or forgotten. She visited schools and spoke to students about propaganda and lies, and how easy it is to hate people you have never met. She told them about the blizzard and the Canadian soldiers who carried enemy prisoners through the snow. "We were taught to fear them," she would say, looking at the young, unscarred faces in front of her. "We were told they were monsters who would hurt us. But when we were freezing and broken, it was the enemy who carried us to warmth." Humanity does not recognize uniform colors. It only recognizes suffering and the choice to help. When she was 62 years old, Greta donated the wool blanket to a war museum in Berlin. It was a difficult moment for her to part with it, but she knew it belonged to history now. She stood in front of a group of reporters and held up the faded, worn blanket. "This belonged to a Canadian soldier who gave it to me when I was a prisoner," she said, her voice strong and clear. "He did not have to do that. I was his enemy. But he saw a young woman who was cold and suffering, and he chose kindness over hate." This blanket is proof that even in the darkest moments of war, humanity can survive. I kept it all these years to remind myself that propaganda dies the moment you look into the eyes of someone carrying you through a blizzard. Greta lived to be 84 years old. She spent decades telling her story, fighting against the lies that led to war, teaching people to question what their governments tell them. In her final interview before she died, a young journalist asked her what the most important lesson was from her experience. Greta thought for a moment, her eyes drifting back to a snowy day in 1945. Then she said, "Real courage is not about fighting your enemies. Real courage is about protecting them when they are vulnerable, even when everything in your culture tells you to hate them." Those Canadian soldiers did not just save 87 women that day. They proved that humanity can win even when everything else has failed. They taught me that kindness is stronger than any propaganda, and that lesson is what I want to leave behind. The wool blanket still sits in that museum today, behind glass with a small sign that tells the story of the blizzard and the soldiers who carried their enemies to safety. Thousands of people see it every year. And maybe some of them, looking at that old faded blanket, learn the same lesson Greta learned, that the real enemy is not the person on the other side wearing a different uniform. The real enemy is the lie that tells you they are less human than you are.